Hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Bolen. I'm the pastor at Midway United Methodist Church. I'm also a pastor at Edgewater United Methodist Church. I want to thank you so much for taking some time and for watching this video. And as we begin and as we come into this video, I want to start with a question. How do you find joy in the midst of suffering? I mean, whenever you're facing, whenever you're facing a challenge, or whenever you're facing something that is testing you, is it possible to find joy in the midst of that kind of challenge? Is it possible to find joy in the midst of that kind of test? Is it possible to find joy in the midst of suffering? I'm not talking about after you have had the life preserver thrown at you. I'm not talking about after the rescue boat has come to you. I'm talking about when you're in the midst of it. That when you are in the very midst and when you are in the heart of suffering, is it possible to find joy? You know, one of the things about it is that I do have the opportunity to serve churches. I've got a wonderful opportunity to serve two churches. I'm a pastor at both of those churches. And sometimes being a pastor, being a preacher, I'm able to be in some conversations that I just find myself in the midst of those conversations, and I think, how in the world did I get here? It's only because God has given me enough grace to be there. And I remember this. I remember being with someone who was in the midst of suffering. I remember being with someone who was incarcerated. Think about this, is this place that we were in, and there's this glass that's separating us. We're holding phones as we're talking to each other, unable to shake hands, unable to do any of that kind of physical touch like that, but we're there. And this is a person who was facing a trial. It's a very real trial. It was a legal trial. There were attorneys that were connected to it. The district attorney was involved in it. There was evidence. There was everything that was in the midst of that trial. And I noticed, and it's one of those things that came across as amazing in that conversation that we were having, that was inside a jail, is that there was joy that was coming through there. There was joy that was coming across, and it wasn't from me. It was joy that was coming from the other side. And in fact, I was a preacher again that was not and not used to being in that kind of situation. So there's all kinds of things that were going on with me, but there was joy that came across in our conversation, and there was joy that was found in the midst of suffering. That's what I'm asking you, because I don't know where you're at. I don't know the kind of experiences that you're having. I don't know the kind of things that are going on in your life, but I do want to say that it is possible. That it is possible to find joy in the midst of suffering. It is possible to find joy in the midst of trials. It is possible to find joy that no matter what kind of test or no matter what kind of challenge you find yourself personally with right now, that there is joy that can be found and there is joy that can be discovered in the midst of that suffering. And maybe you are not in a place where you're at right now, but I imagine that you're probably in a fairly close relationship with someone that right now needs to hear that joy can be found in the midst of suffering. And this is not just the kind of preacher wisdom that I have. It's not just the kind of experiences that I've had with other people, but there is a particular Bible passage. And it's one of a couple others, but particularly if you take a look at the New Testament, you find this way of thinking about suffering, this way of kind of pulling back the lens of suffering and kind of seeing what exactly is happening in suffering. And you find this way of discovering joy that happens in the midst of suffering. And one particular Bible passage that I want to encourage you to take a moment and to take a look at is a New Testament passage. This is the first chapter of the book of James. It's James chapter 1, verse 2 through 8. And this is exactly what James writes in James chapter 1, verse 2. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. And James continues, and he says this: if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given you. But ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea who is driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. James chapter 1, those are verses 2 through 8. And that right there, that is a pattern of life for everybody that is in the midst of suffering and for everybody that is in the midst of trials, whether they are legal trials or whether they are trials that have been created by the circumstances and the season of life that all of us find ourselves in at times. You see, one of the things that James makes very clear to us is that as followers of Jesus Christ and as Christians, that we are going to face trials, we are going to face tests, we are going to face challenges, we are in fact going to face troubles. You know, this is a letter that James is beginning to write in the New Testament. It is a letter that James is going to send to other people who are Christians. And he begins at the start of this, and he says, to all of those who are in the dispersion, to all of those who have been scattered, to all those who are dispersed. And oftentimes what would happen in a traditional letter is that you would say, I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your endurance. I thank you for the way that you have supported me. I thank you for all those things that you have done. Oftentimes what you will find in letters, and still we have these kind of traditional patterns of letters, you know, you don't just start off saying that whenever you are in the face of suffering. But these are people who have endured a lot. And so if you are in a place, or if you know someone who is enduring a lot right now, this is a letter that is written for you. And so this is the remarkable thing that James is able to offer. And it's one of those things that we hold together that is unique to Christianity, is unique to what it means to be a believer, what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. That whenever we are in the midst of trials, that no matter what they are, you see, this is the real truth that comes from the New Testament, that no matter what kind of trial that we are in, and I want to say this too, that whether we are the person who has created that trial, whether we are the person who has created that suffering, or if the trial has been forced on us, or the suffering, the testing, the challenges have been forced upon us, that whether we have created them ourselves or they have been forced upon us, that the way that we live, the way of life, and the pattern of life that we have that Jesus Christ shows us is the same. So no matter where you find yourself in right now, that when you are facing trials, consider it nothing but joy. You see, the real truth that comes out of this is that as we begin to embrace the suffering, as we begin to embrace the trial and the challenges that come our way, that is the very place that we can begin to consider joy. That is the very place that we can begin to find joy. Because what happens, and this is what James is so extraordinarily helpful for, is that James is able to show us that when we lean into the suffering, and I know that it can be tempting. I know that it can be more than tempting that when we find ourselves facing suffering to sort of stop and hesitate a little bit. But James says if we lean into them, that whenever we are facing trials of any kind, that once we lean into those, we know that what is happening in the midst of that when we take that first step into suffering, that when we lean into suffering, we know that what is happening right here is that our faith, in essence, our trust in God, what God has promised to us, who God is in our lives, that it is the testing of our faith. It is the testing of our faith and our trust in God. And because we know that when our test and when our faith and that when our trust in God, that when we know that it is tested, that when we know that it is this kind of stress test that this suffering has produced in our lives, that this stress test that is coming down upon us and that is coming into our lives, that we know that when our faith is tested, that when we know that when our trust in God, that when it is put through the test, we know that if we are able to endure that endurance is going to have an effect on us. How amazing is it to know that not only can we find joy in suffering, but we know that there is something that is happening in the midst of trials, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of tests, in the midst of challenges that are in our lives, because our faith, our trust in God is being tested. And as our faith and our trust in God, as it is tested, it produces an endurance in us that leads us into a place where we can find and discover maturity and a completeness and a lacking in nothing. You know, it's often been said It's often been said that an untested faith is, well, an untested faith is one of those areas, or one of those places in our lives, in essence, an untested trust in God. That is one of those things that becomes theoretical. You know, I can remember some of these conversations that I had throughout my life, and in some places that I was being led by God to go into. And so I would reach out to some mentors, I would reach out to some peers, and so I would get to that place where oftentimes it is challenging to do, to really make the decision, say, you know what, I'm going to go in this direction that God is moving me into. I'm going to go into an unknown place that God has sort of drawn in my heart, that God has sort of led me into right now. And some of my best peers, some of my best mentors would say, get ready. Because what is going to happen now is that there's going to be a test. There's going to be a stress test on that trust. There's going to be a stress test upon that faith that you have. But you know, one of the great things about this particular passage is that we know, as James unfolds to us, we know that we were able to face a trial, and that we were able to face a suffering, that we were even able to face the very things, the very bedrocks of our own lives, that is our faith and our trust in God, because we know that as our faith is tested, that our endurance in the middle of that test, that what it is able to do is it is able to have an effect on us to make us mature and complete where we are lacking in nothing. It brings us into a place in our lives that we never would have gotten to on our own, but it is through the suffering, it is through the test and the challenge that we find a faith that is complete and mature and lacking in nothing. But then James begins to offer us, and you remember those other words that James says to us, but if any of you is lacking in wisdom in this moment, if any of you is lacking in wisdom in the midst of suffering, ask God. And what a great invitation. You know, as I'm making this video, it is in the midst, I'm my own context, my own location is in Alabama. We were in the midst of a hot summer, as Alabama usually has. This is a particular week when there have been heat advisories for us. In fact, my family and I, we took a vacation a couple of weeks ago, and those heat advisories, they were right there with us. So we didn't, even in our vacation, we did not escape those heat advisories. But there's this old phrase, it's called the dog days of summer. I don't know if you've ever used it before, but the dog days of summer. And in the dog days of summer is this understanding, this place of imagining, you know what, that in the summer, that when the heat really starts to get so hot, and when the humidity starts to get so high, that what's going to happen is that all of us, we're not going to be able to endure the way that we think that we should be able to endure. We're not going to do as much as we imagine what we're going to be doing. We're going to find ourselves missing a step. We're going to find ourselves losing some time, because in the heat, it's just going to come down to us. It's just going to endure. It's just going to be there. But not only do we face the dog days of summer right now, but also in the midst of the dog days of summer, we are in a place right now where we are looking at variants of COVID, where we are looking to revisit those questions that we thought were in the rearview mirror, those questions about, should I wear a mask, should I not wear a mask, those questions, those challenges, this even suffering. Is it okay for me to go here? Is it okay for me to attend this event? Is it okay? Who can I hug? Who can I shake hands with? Who is it okay for me to get closer than 6 feet with? All those kinds of challenges, that kind of suffering that just comes upon us, this season of life that comes upon us and challenges us, especially like COVID and like these variants where we thought that they were in the rearview mirror, but now we see that they're even bigger. It's bigger than the windshield that's in front of us. But what James reminds us, that in the midst of that, even though we know and embrace and understand, of knowing that that when we're in the midst of suffering, that in these trials and these challenges that we face, that consider it nothing but joy, because what is happening is that we are being people who endure. We are being people who are resilient. And if we allow that endurance and that resilience to have its full effect, we will find a faith that is mature and complete and lacking in nothing. But, and this is what James says to us, and this is what I want to offer to you this morning, but if you are lacking in this wisdom, ask God. If you're just hearing these words, and if you're finding yourself in the particular place that you are suffering right now, if you're just hearing these as only words, I want to encourage you to do this. I want to encourage you in this moment and at this time right now, stop the video and ask God to give you wisdom. Because no matter where we find ourselves in, that at every place in our life, and particularly it is always more helpful when we are facing trials and suffering. Ask God to give us wisdom, because what can happen is that it can be tempting to get ahead of ourselves and to get ahead of even God. You see, this is what James will talk about in James chapter 1, verse 2, and particularly verse 5 through 8. He will say that if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously, ungrudgingly. It will be given to you. God's wisdom will come. All you have to do is you just have to ask for it, but you've got to ask in complete faith. You've got to ask in complete trust, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. And I think one of the most tragic aspects of suffering is that in our own human attempt to get out of the suffering, in our own human attempt to dismiss the suffering and make it end as quickly as possible, we can oftentimes be tempted to get ahead of ourselves and even get us ahead of God. And what James is asking you, in the midst of whatever trial you are facing right now, in whatever season of life you are facing right now, James is asking you to lean into that suffering and to lean into that trial, knowing that what is going to happen is you are going to experience an endurance. God will move you through that trial. You will experience an endurance that will have a full effect, where you will be mature and complete and lacking in nothing. Just make sure that you are asking God to grant you wisdom in the midst of the direction that you are going into that suffering. Because it is that wisdom that will enable you to overcome any doubt that you may have. And it is that wisdom that will begin to meet in your trust of God or your faith of God. And that is the one thing that will keep you steady no matter what trial or no matter what suffering you are facing right now. You see, it was that kind of steadiness and it was that kind of calmness that I not only saw when I was sitting across from someone who was facing a trial, a very real trial, a legal trial, but it was the kind of calmness and the kind of joy that I was able to experience in the midst of the conversation. That again, it's one of those kinds of conversations that you know that it's only because God has brought you into that place that you're having this extraordinary conversation. But I felt it. I felt the joy that was coming across, because at every step of the way, this was a person who knew theoretically that what was happening is that their very life was being tested, that their very life was on trial, their very life was being tried, and they knew that as their life was being tried, that what was happening is that there was an endurance that was coming almost minute by minute, saying, this is something that you are going to endure. It is going to make you mature and complete and lacking in nothing. And you've got a chance every second of every minute to ask God to grant you one more second, one more minute, one more hour of wisdom for what is coming next. You see, what James offers us is not just pie in the sky kind of thinking. It is not ducking our heads into the sand or whatever other cliches that you want to add in that moment. What James offers us is this opportunity to take a look at suffering and to begin to lean into that suffering, and find the kind of joy that will come when we face trials or face suffering of any kind, because we know that our faith and our trust in God is being tested, and that in the stress test of our faith, that we are capable right here and right now of producing an endurance that will carry us to a full effect where we will be mature and complete and lacking in nothing. That's something that happens in the midst of suffering. It's something that happens in the midst of trials, and that is the reason that I invite you to find joy in suffering. Because suffering, when it meets with God's grace, it has a full effect where all of us can find a completeness and a maturity, and all of us can find that even in the midst of suffering, that there is nothing that is lacking in our life or our character. If you are in a place where you are suffering right now, as I end this video, I'm going to pray and I'm going to lift you up. If you are with others who are suffering right now, I pray that you will do that same thing with them. Well, again, thank you so much for watching, for taking the time, for watching this video. I hope that it is helpful for you. Take a look at James chapter 1, verse 2 through 8 for your own self. In the midst of every trial that you find yourself in, the midst of every test, the midst of every challenge, find complete joy. Thanks be to God, and may God's blessings be upon all of you, both now and forevermore. Amen.